This is AIM Agenda. Thanks for your company this morning. With me now, the Shadow Environment Minister, Greg Hunt. Thanks for your time.
It's a pleasure.
On asylum seekers, Scott Morrison last night said even if the government adopted all of the Coalition's policy, that you might not support it through the Parliament. Well, does that make sense?
We want a solution, and that's actually what Scott is saying. We want a solution. We warned about these tragedies. We said that if you take away the policies that were in place, there would be a mass flow of boats, and therefore there would inevitably be tragedies. Let's begin with the point here that our focus, our motivation, our concern has been the tragedies at sea, all of which we predicted and warned about in advance. Since the policy was changed by the ALP, there has been an almost 100-fold increase in boat arrivals in terms of the number of people on a per annum basis.
Okay, so if you want a solution and the government was willing to adopt the Coalition's policy, Mr Morrison last night did not concede that you would support it. It just seems nonsensical if they're willing to back your policy.
Look, our approach is we want an outcome that will actually stop the boats. The Malaysian solution, which is the only government position at this point in time...
So you're saying the Coalition would back then its own policy through the Parliament? It just seems ridiculous to say otherwise.
Look, our approach is to support an effective solution. But the Malaysian approach has been tried and already failed. It was implemented by the government. There have been 8,000 arrivals since it was first announced. And it's important to remember that the quota had been filled within a matter of weeks. The people smugglers had broken the quota for the Malaysian solution long before the High Court made any decision. So the people smugglers looked at this capped approach and they just bypassed it. They ran it down.
But there was a capped approach in Nauru as well, because there was only so much capacity and then you had to move to Manus Island. It's just the nature of these policies.
Well, it was effective and it worked. And it worked for a number of reasons, because it was part of a broader package with temporary protection visas, with the willingness to intercept at sea, and the absolute clarity of vision that we will break the people smugglers. Instead, the people smugglers broke the government. We
know that that policy, the framework for that. Now it comes down to whether or not the leaders are going to be able to reach some middle ground. A number of backbench MPs yesterday met Liberal, Labor and Independent, frustrated at the stalemate. Do you understand their frustration?
Well, absolutely, because we lived and breathed and warned, and I remember being on Sky and warning of the risks and tragedies which would come from breaking the protections we'd put in place.
But the frustration at the inability of your leaders, your leader and the government, to reach a compromise. Mr Abbott's not showing any sign of compromise here.
Actually, with great respect, it is the Prime Minister who hasn't changed a word of her legislation, who hasn't changed an element of her policy since they put forward Malaysia, and the Malaysian solution was tried and destroyed by the people smugglers. Not just beaten, but destroyed by the people smugglers within a matter of weeks. If the Prime Minister wants to compromise, there is a policy that works. There is a policy that's on the table. There is a policy which actually stops this trade. Now, there's a question mark as to whether or not the people smugglers would ever do anything to allow this government to be seen to be effective. They don't believe in this government, but we will break the people smugglers. The people smugglers broke this government.
Onto another issue, the brown coal power station Hazlewood, one of the dirtiest power stations in the country, had to rely on a bailout from its international parent company, but it didn't seek funds from the government's Energy Security Council. Doesn't that indicate that the owner or the company did not think the plant was at risk from the carbon tax itself?
Well, what we've seen already, and I'd just like to correct something there with great respect, we've seen $250 million from the government to Hazlewood in the last 2 weeks. We've seen $250 million from the government to Yallourn in the last 2 weeks. The same amount, $250 million to Loy Yang. Now we've got $42 million to Alcoa, probably to be announced after the Parliament on Friday. So in other words, the Prime Minister won't even have the gumption to come into the Parliament to acknowledge this latest bailout. So we've had Hazlewood, Yallourn, Loy Yang, all receiving $250 million or thereabouts. Alcoa, $42 million. Who is the next firm to get a bailout? Because all of these firms have had cash being paid before the end of the financial year in order to ring-fence them against the intended impacts of the carbon tax.
But as you heard from the Trade Minister a bit earlier, that's part of the policy here, isn't it? And your own direct action plan, from memory, includes paying out companies like that at Hazlewood to shut down the dirtiest power stations. So you would be doing something similar.
No, there is an important distinction here. We're proposing a clean-up of the power stations if they're the lowest cost way to capture and reduce emissions. They're proposing a shutdown and a closure of the power stations. But there's this incredible confusion in the government. On the one hand, they're giving bailouts to the power stations. On the other hand, they've got contracts for closures. So they're paying the same power stations twice to do completely the opposite thing.
But do you concede that, for example, Alcoa, the aluminium industry is suffering as a result of the high Aussie dollar far more than it is from the impending carbon tax? It's a fraction of the impact of the exchange rate, isn't it?
Well, actually, there are underlying factors which are very significant, which make it the worst possible time. A high dollar, a low metals price. And then you add
which are the
a carbon tax.
They're the dominant factors. You must concede that.
Then you add a carbon tax on top of that, which is a reverse tariff. What's the bailout? It's a carbon tax bailout of $42 million. What's it doing? It's covering a carbon tax bill of about $42 million. So you have complete confusion from the government, and you have real impacts on the real economy and people's lives.
One last issue. I know you were part of the Howard government team that came up with the school chaplaincy program when you were the parliamentary secretary. Do you welcome the government's legislation to protect that program, and will the coalition support it?
Yes, I categorically welcome it. I think they're doing the right thing. We're not blaming the government here. That was a decision of the High Court. And we will be supportive of it. So this is a good thing. It's a good program.
Supportive of the legislation, even though it's not just specific to school chaplaincy, it's across the board for those direct payments that bypass states. The coalition will back that. That's
my understanding. It hasn't been brought before the Cabinet because it hasn't been brought before the Parliament, but we want to do everything we can to support the chaplaincy program, and this is a point of agreement with the government.
Mr Hunt, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, a number of